Imagine trying to fight a criminal conviction, but instead of using a standard legal plea, you submit a massive 30,000-word manuscript written right from inside a prison cell. Well, today, in this explainer, we're jumping right into the anatomy of this incredibly unusual document, something often referred to as a blood letter. It was written by Dr. Chen Jinyuan, a scholar who was convicted of spreading false information online. Now, what makes this source material so absolutely fascinating isn't just the intense circumstances of how it was created. It's the highly structured, genuinely multidisciplinary approach of the document itself. Instead of your typical appeal, the author actually builds a defense that spans across law, mathematics, psychology, and even international human rights. So my goal today is to neutrally walk you through the structural arguments laid out in this remarkable text, and break down exactly how this scholar dissects his very own conviction.
Right off the bat, the source material frames this whole document with a really powerful description. It calls it a symbol of the era, an existence-level proof. You know, when you think of a legal defense, you usually picture lawyers arguing over dry statutes, right? But the author of this document took a completely different path. The analysis we're looking at today essentially treats Dr. Chen's manuscript as a four-part academic autopsy of a single legal case. When conventional legal avenues just felt totally exhausted, the defendant turned to complex systems theory, behavioral psychology, and international law to dismantle the state's case against him. We're going to look through each of these four lenses today to see exactly how this defense was built.
Okay, let's dive into this with our first section, Lens 1, the legal void.
So the source begins its analysis at the very starting line of criminal procedure, the indictment. The manuscript argues that an indictment really should be a bridge connecting factual actions to the law, but it points out that in this case, that bridge was fundamentally hollow. It breaks this down into three critical flaws in the state's evidence chain. First up, the document highlights that the indictment totally failed to list any specific false information. Like, it accused the scholar of spreading falsehoods over a 3-year period, but didn't point to a single concrete poster article that was actually fabricated. Second, the requirement of subjective intent, which basically means proving the defendant actually knew the information was false, well, that was entirely presumed. According to the source, the court's logic was kind of just that because the defendant had a PhD, he, quote, should have known better. That effectively bypassed the need for actual proof of malicious intent. And third, the conviction required the action to cause a severe disruption to public order, yet the author notes there was absolutely zero evidence presented to prove that disruption ever actually happened.
And honestly, that third point is absolutely crucial, which is why the source material gives it its own dedicated focus. The document emphasizes that severe disruption cannot just be some abstract claim, It requires real-world proof. Under the relevant legal interpretations, this means you need tangible data, stuff like triggering a mass offline event, causing actual public panic, or hitting a specific virality threshold, like 5,000 views. As anyone who's ever tried to go viral on social media knows for sure, that requires actual measurable metrics. The scholar's defense highlights that the prosecution provided no public opinion analysis, no police reports of actual chaos, and no viral metrics whatsoever. So the legal requirement was essentially left floating in a void, completely unproven by any actual data.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it shifts us right into Lens 2, the math of virality.
Since the state claimed this massive public disruption, the scholar actually decided to test that claim mathematically. And to do this, the manuscript applies something called the Galton-Watson branching process. For those unfamiliar, this is a really classic mathematical model used to study information cascades and epidemic spread. Basically, it calculates how an initial spark, in this specific case, a single tweet or retweet, reproduces and spreads through a network. The author takes this model and applies it directly to his own social media account to track the true potential scale of his information cascade.
Take a look at the extinction probability, highlighted here. Lambda represents the average number of new branches, or let's just say retweets, generated by a single post. The document notes that Dr. Chen's account had fewer than 100 followers, making him what's known as an edge node in the network. A pretty conservative estimate gives him a lambda of 0.1, which means for every 10 times he posts, it only generates one single new retweet. And as the data clearly shows, at a lambda of 0.1, the probability of the information cascade simply dying out is greater than 99.9%. Scientifically speaking, an epidemic of information is statistically impossible under these specific conditions.
So, what is the actual mathematical reality of his network influence? Well, the model calculates that the average total cascade size for his posts is exactly 1.11 retweets. Yeah, literally just over one single retweet. The source uses this rigorous mathematical modeling to quantitatively disprove the indictment. It argues that claiming a grand cascade of 1.11 retweets somehow caused a severe disruption to public order is, from a purely mathematical and scientific standpoint, completely absurd.
And this brilliantly illustrates a stark analogy used by the author regarding these edge nodes. The source states that holding a peripheral node responsible for systemic chaos is basically like blaming a single spark for a massive forest fire without proving the forest was dry, or honestly, even proving there was a fire in the first place. In network science, edge nodes simply do not have the structural capacity to trigger system-wide avalanches, unless the entire system is already in a hypercritical state, which, by the way, the prosecution never claimed or proved.
Having totally dismantled the math, the manuscript turns to Lens 3, the psychology of the court.
The source material views the courtroom interactions as this fascinating clash of cognitive profiles. On one side, you've got the judicial system operating on a bureaucratic mindset, one that demands compliance, clear-cut categories, and rapid processing. Then, on the other side, you have the defendant. Evaluated through the Big Five personality model, he's shown as having high openness to complex ideas and low agreeableness when it comes to submitting to authority without solid logical proof. The system just wanted a simple confession. The scholar wanted a rigorous debate based on complex system theory. They were literally speaking entirely different psychological languages.
The source goes even further, neutrally explaining how specific cognitive biases were operating within the judicial process to reach a guilty verdict. First up, confirmation bias. It's something we all do, right? Like when we only read news we agree with. Well, the court only sought information that confirmed the guilty hypothesis, entirely ignoring the obvious lack of actual disruption. Second, the fundamental attribution error. The system attributed the scholar's actions to inherent malice, completely ignoring the situational context of a researcher who was just exploring and sharing ideas. And finally, groupthink, that intense pressure within any bureaucratic system to conform to a predetermined outcome. The document argues this suppressed any independent critical analysis from anyone inside the court.
Let's move to and see how this builds into our final section, Lens 4, International Standards.
Here, the defense actually elevates its argument to the global stage. It objectively lists several specific international treaty articles that it claims were directly breached. For instance, it points to the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, specifically Article 19, regarding the freedom to seek, receive, and impart information, Article 9, which protects against arbitrary detention, and Article 14, guaranteeing a fair trial. The source notes that the judge repeatedly telling the defendant to shut up during his defense violated the basic requirement of an impartial tribunal. It also cites the ICESCR, specifically Article 15, which protects the right to take part in cultural and scientific life without facing criminal penalties just for intellectual exploration.
Ultimately, the source material frames this entire ordeal as exactly this: a clash of systems, bureaucracy versus science.
So the crucial point is that the manuscript sees this as the collision of a rigid legal bureaucracy, which desperately needs a simple narrative, crashing into a scientific mind that utterly refuses to abandon nuance. And it leaves us with this final provocative dilemma. Should criminal law be used to punish thoughts and intellectual explorations that differ from the mainstream, or should it strictly be reserved for actions that cause actual, measurable physical harm and real-world disruption? This whole 30,000-word analysis serves as such a fascinating case study in exactly how we define harm, intent, and truth in the digital age. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the systems around you.